Well, good evening and welcome to the live stream on the 30th of April, 2024. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analysts. It's great to have you on the show tonight. And we're going to have an important conversation about some of the broader political themes that are going on, and also trying to get to some of the underlying questions about what's driving the behavior of politicians, what's driving the behavior of the economy, and how does that interface with what's good for ordinary Australians and I guess people around the world as well. So very important conversation. And just before I bring Robbie in, let me just remind you, as I always do, that we don't provide specific financial or legal advice on the channel here. It's general conversation only. We moderate the stream, but I encourage you to put your thoughts and questions in. I won't necessarily follow all of the streams in the chat, but I always encourage you to ask questions. And if you want to ask a question for Robbie specifically, if you use @WalkTheWorld, that'll get into my separate queue, and then that's a good chance of getting the question on the show tonight. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that if you want to get your question up on the list, you can do that, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always greatly appreciated. We do this not for profit, but because we think there's a really important conversation to be had. And frankly, at the moment, these conversations are ever more important. Now, let me, at this stage, bring Robbie in. Robbie, hello there. Welcome, welcome.
Hello, Martin.
Great to have you back on again. And we've been making a few shows over the last few months because there are so many things going on. But this is, I think, almost a bit of a culmination of some thematics that we've been wanting to explore for some time.
Yeah, certainly. Actually, I was just thinking we've probably been making shows for 6 years now. You and me. So lots happened in those 6 years, but some of our themes, I think, are definitely coming to a head. But one of the things that people tend to comment about the approach that I like to focus on is it really is more about what are we doing about it rather than just commentary on, how it's what the threats are and how everything's going bad. There is things to do. And the only way to stay sane sometimes is focus on the things that you can do. And I think in some regards, especially on the cash and banking front, I think we're actually starting to make some genuine progress. So we can talk about that, and then we can talk about the things that are a bit probably seemingly harder to impact, which is the big geopolitical issues. But we can impact them if we actually have an understanding of the truth. So we can talk about that as well.
Yeah, terrific. What is truth is going to be an interesting question, right? And who defines what truth is, and to what extent is truth manifest in the mainstream media and on socials, or are we being fed? I called it propaganda, actually, because to my mind, there's a lot of propaganda out there. There's a lot of stuff being pushed out, which is really to set an agenda which isn't necessarily aligned specifically to truth. Before we get into that, Robbie, for those who don't know, just a brief sentence or two on the Citizens Party and your role, because, of course, there is actually a whole party organisation behind what you do.
Yeah, certainly. Sometimes I don't get to do it much anymore. You and I have done a lot of shows where I'm in my office at work, and there's a door beside me. And if I open that door, that is in that room is the real engine of how our party operates. So the Citizens Party has been going since '88. So this year it's going to be our 36th year. And in that time, part of our success is surviving over that time, because a lot of minor parties, come and go, and they're flashes in the pan. But we have achieved real success through grassroots organising. We have a significant following in the community among the people who know us, and that's the rub right there, because the media they tend not to do their job of reporting politics fairly, I feel, and so not enough people do know us. But we've always stood for a people's first approach to policy, and policies to return government to the people. And that means economic policies that benefit people. That means a foreign policy which is like economic policy and foreign policy are big themes nowadays, because that's where the big issues are and the big threats are. But a foreign policy that's independent, that doesn't get us into wars, because that is definitely not, wars are not people first. Wars are, mass death for people. And we'll touch on that a bit later. But the number, we're a party that's had a number one policy for pretty much its whole existence, which is a national bank. Because unless you get the fundamental power of what drives an economy back in the hands of the people to benefit the people, then governments can fiddle at the edges, but they're not going to actually have the reins of power, true power. And politicians of great standing of yesteryear, people like John Curtin, actually made those points, right? Unless government controls monetary policy, it actually isn't in charge. Someone else is in charge. And in a democracy, that's not acceptable. So we think a national bank is a very powerful, important tool for a government to have if the government's truly going to deliver the economic policy on behalf of the people. And we have become really the experts in Australia on the history of the Commonwealth Bank and how it worked, and why that kind of institution is so sorely needed again today. And that's what we've known for. And in the last, well, the reason, your and my relationship and your collaboration with the Citizens Party on the issues we work on is 6 years old, is because that coincides with this period where there's been enormous tumult in the population about economic policy. What's happening to the banks? Are our deposits safe? What's happening to cash, etc.? And people are increasingly focusing on that. And we've been able to help shed light on that through activism, getting up Senate inquiries, etc., that shed even more light on it, forcing politicians to actually face issues that they otherwise would not have ever have faced if we weren't involved, if we weren't campaigning for them to do that. And I see real progress in our work in that latter 6 years, which has been pretty much unprecedented for us.
Yes, and I want to underscore, I think, two things, Robbie. One is, DFA is partly about having conversations about really important things. But secondly, it's to make change and to actually push in things in a different direction, right? And the reason that's important, because what I find is that we have a lot of people who are, corralled into a particular way of thinking, perhaps partly because they're really busy, perhaps partly because they're just trying to get by, but also partly because elsewhere in the mainstream media, a lot of the issues are positioned a particular way, I'd almost say spun a particular way, with a particular set of agendas. And sometimes those agendas are never transparent to people. So one of the things I try to do on the channel here is to say, well, what's really behind what's going on? I'm a philosopher by training and by inclination. So I tend to want to ask the why question, but the why question, but the why question more than many others. So I don't necessarily just take the first level of answers that come out, right? And of course, some politicians find that quite awkward, because when you actually start peeling back the onion, what you discover is that what you thought was true is not necessarily true. And I guess let's take the cash situation, and specifically the regional branch inquiry, is a good example of this, right? Because 18 months or so ago, we were pushing hard on the worrisome trend of regional banks disappearing. So effectively branches in regional areas just closing left, right and centre. I'd been talking about this for quite some time. Of course, our journalist, compatriot too, was absolutely all over this, and I think kudos to her in terms of she's been driving a lot of the agenda. But together, what we're able to Daryl, yeah. So what we're able to do was to get momentum for a significant piece of Senate time to look at what was really going on. And we had, 13 hearings around the country where the Senate went out into the regions and got, the same story actually from almost wherever you went across the country. And that story was astonishingly different from what the banks told us was going on. right? And they sort of trotted out these Mickey Mouse statistics saying nobody's using branches anymore, nobody's using cash anymore. We're just going, everyone's going digital. We had Anna Bligh, of course, who's in charge of the Australian Banking Association, their spokesperson. I would say they're Muppet or puppet, depending on how you want to define it, right? But she was saying, there's nothing, this is just part of the natural scheme of things. Digital is the future. But out in the regional land where you actually went and I think probably hold a record actually for attendance of these inquiries, the story was so different. And as a result of that, we've now got some interesting questions that really needs to be asked. So give us your sort of standing back reflections on the 13 hearings. And what were the key thematics that came out, and what was a takeaway? And do you think the senators will actually come good on the hearings?
Well, the last question is a $64,000 one, Martin. We'll park that. We'll find out on the 16th of May when the report comes out. But yeah, 13 hearings in 13 months. Now, 3 of them were in Canberra, so they were the easy ones, but the rest involved quite a bit of travelling, including to pretty far away places like Cloncurry, which I had to get to through Mount Isa. And the big one was Tom Price in Western Australia. But the power of this inquiry was what you observed at the beginning, that the hearings were remarkably similar. The feedback from the communities was universal. And that's what proves the banks are lying. That's what proves Anna Bligh is a liar. That when the feedback is so consistent, then you know that this claim that we had identified was what their propaganda line. Oh, we're following our customers into digital banking. They're voting with their feet to show they want digital banking. By closing branches, we're giving them what they want. I mean, it was that Orwellian, right? It was that newspeak. We're giving them what they want. Anna Bligh went hard on that the day before the very first hearing in Sale. And I know those senators didn't know how to contradict that. They knew that they were getting complaints from the public, but they don't think about these things very hard most of the time, right? They also give the corporations the benefit of the doubt like crazy. I mean, it disgusts me, to be honest, but anyway, they do. Because the corporations, like the banks, they're powerful lobbyists. And they're powerful donors. They donate big dollars. Well, sort of big dollars. The banks are big donors in the overall scheme of things in Australian politics, but considering what they get for their money, I reckon the donations from the banks show that the banks think that Australian politicians, Martin, are pretty damn cheap. They treat them like cheap whores. The way they just flicker, $14 million to the Liberal Party over 9 years, $9 million to the Labor Party over the same 9 years, and for that they get protected in a position from which they are able to reap billions and billions and billions and billions in the most protected industry in Australia, right? Those politicians are pretty damn cheap for that. So the politicians went into it, not with the convictions that we had. They absolutely didn't, apart from the, some gutsy ones like Senator Malcolm Roberts and Jared Rennick. But I know, because I had the privilege, even though there was a lot of traveling, of witnessing every second of the testimony of all these 13 hearings. I saw the evolving realization in these senators over the course of the hearings. And I saw the change in tone over the course of the hearings, where they went from carpeting the banks over things that were sort of like low-hanging fruit, such as the lack of consultation. So in other words, not disputing the legitimacy of closing the branch, but why didn't you consult properly? That's how they started. That's where the real passion was in the first hearing, right? Because there was disgusting behavior by the banks. They didn't consult properly. But the politicians were going after that rather than questioning the legitimacy of the actual branch closures. And then as it's unfolding, it's starting to dawn on them, hang on, oh, are the branches unprofitable? No, that's not a factor. And to me, that was the first big wow moment that because I knew they weren't unprofitable. Um, I know Senator Gerard Rennick, who's actually been a bank accountant, knew they weren't unprofitable because he understands how the accounting can work. You were the first to explain to me actually how the accounting tricks work, right? Moving the big profitable accounts out of the branch, et cetera, into another branch. So we knew the tricks going into it. These politicians were learning some of this stuff for the first time, seemingly. So that was a big one. And then it was the universal themes of cash, like, the word cash is the word of the inquiry because banking is a service for a purpose. The purpose is, what does it do? It provides cash, right? And they got the message from one end of the country to the other, literally, we need cash and we need banks to be able to provide us the cash and help us bank it safely. That was clear cut, absolutely clear cut. And the other one was just the sheer bastardry, which I've carried on in these conversations before about. And it is bastardry, sheer bastardry of completely callous bank executives not giving the slightest stuff that when they're pulling out that, especially that last branch out of town, what they are condemning that town to. So in the very last hearing, the mayor of Mitchell, this was the hearing in Bribey Island, she sort of summed up the whole feedback from 13 hearings this way. We are being set up to fail. That's the way she put it. And that line is representative of every community that testified before this hearing. We are being set up to fail. And to reiterate to the viewer now, this is the reality that contradicts what the banks were saying, that they were giving these communities what they want. Right? So the politicians, to come to your final question, I don't know what they're going to deliver, but I know what they know now. And if what they do deliver, Martin, does not match what they know now, then there will be political hell to pay, because we can organize a bloody peasants' revolt, dig Wat Tyler up and go storm the city of London to bring these guys down, because if they don't come up with something that matches the reality of what they were confronted with, then they're not going to get away with it politically. And frankly, it would be literally insane for them not to come up with, like, if you're a major party politician of all parties, you should be acutely aware of one figure, one overriding reality in your mind. It's the number 30, because your primary vote on both sides of politics is locked. Liberal and Labor is locked in the early 30s. Locked. They've never got a smaller primary vote in their existence. They should be turning heaven and earth to get that primary vote up. And how do you do that? Well, here's a novel idea. Give the public what they bloody want. And they want banks. They want branches. They want service. They don't want to be screwed. They want to be able to function when they transact under all conditions, whether the power is on or off, whether the internet's on or off, etc. So don't take away their ability to do cash. Give them what they want for once. Because there's one CEO of Commonwealth Bank versus probably 15 million bloody customers of Commonwealth Bank. You're a politician. You need to get elected. Do you appeal to the one freaking CEO or the 15 million customers who want service? And if you don't appeal to the 15 million customers, there's not a logical explanation that doesn't go to corruption, frankly. And this is where we'll take this conversation if this inquiry fails to deliver something that matches the power of the hearings.
Yeah, a couple of observations, Robbie, from mine. The first is, of course, was the banks were predicating their position based on access to digital services. And one of the critical issues that came out from pretty much everywhere in those hearings was that digital access is a thing. It's not a thing. You can't get access. So there were stories of people flying up in a helicopter to try and actually get connectivity to make a transaction. So the
The
reality.
father of a senator. That was the father of a senator had to go up in a helicopter to do his banking near the Telstra tower.
Yeah, nice if you can afford to get the helicopters to make the transaction, right? But the point is that a lot of these bankers and frankly a lot of the politicians who live in the cozy central business districts where the connectivity is not bad have no idea what it's like to be out there where connectivity isn't flash. And by the way, it's not that flash in lots of other areas across the country. No. First point. Second point, the cash issue is fascinating. One, because the volume of cash transactions is rising currently, unlike through the COVID thing when, of course, everyone got misled by rumors that cash was actually spreading it, when of course that was never the case. But that was something which was conveniently played up by certain parties who wanted to get rid of cash. Why? Because cash actually cost banks more, but they are a service provider. That should be part of their mandate, in my view. So volume of cash going up, despite the fact that the ATMs are being ripped out left, right, and centre. And interestingly,
that is extraordinary. Just tonight, I saw a queue at an ATM.
Yep.
You're starting to see queues at ATM because the cash demand is going up, but there's fewer ATMs, and this is lawful.
Yeah. And interestingly, it's not just older people who are using ATMs or using cash. We're finding that more and more young people are now turning back to cash. Why? Because they can manage their own finances more effectively, because actually cash is real, whereas the digital stuff is, it's sort of over there. Firstly. And secondly, of course, you can still use cash when the power goes off. And we've seen in the last few months, we've seen several of the major banks lose their banking systems pretty much completely. And of course, we've had the Optus issue and other connectivity issues. So it shows you just how precarious our banking system is without cash there. And what's fascinating is that whilst the transaction volumes have gone up dramatically because, of course, people are using touch and pay, which means they have more frequent, smaller transactions, the position of cash in those transaction mixes is holding up and growing. And so the whole idea that cash is going to disappear in the next 12 months or whatever it is, which is what some people were saying, is a million miles away. And interestingly, in some other countries, they're actually doing more to ensure that cash will always be available and used for transactions. After all, it is legal tender, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And people may be familiar with the story of Bob Katter, the member for Kennedy in North Queensland, famously a month or so ago using cash in the parliamentary cafeteria. And they didn't accept it. And Bob insisted they accept it. This is legal tender. And he went to the speaker, and the speaker overruled and said, no, the businesses in this parliament must accept cash. And that is a big change in parliament, because since I've been going there, these cafes didn't take cash, and now that this has happened. But the ACCC was consulted. The ACCC actually says, and it's on its website, no, there actually is no obligation on businesses to take cash. Even though it's legal tender, there's no obligation. The thing is, though, Martin, there's only one reason for that. Because the law hasn't caught up with this rather rapid technological change. Because, 25, 30 years ago, nobody could foresee a future where you wouldn't take cash. Right. It's just the law hasn't caught up. So we're going to need a law. And we've actually been in consultation with that. In fact, that's one of the I'll credit John Adams, our friend, the independent economist. He first put this to me that we need to actually scope out what this would mean. So we've been doing some work on that. But there's our friend Jason Bryce from Cash Welcome has done, run an extraordinary grassroots cash campaign. And that was the driver for Cash Out Tuesday at the start of this month on the 2nd of April. Now we'll find out, it's next month, May, when the figures come out, how successful that was. But we already know that the from the RBA's own figures that the February ATM withdrawals for 2024 were 9.5% higher than the February ATM withdrawals for 2023, and that's 10% high. That is significant growth year after year, and that's what that Reserve Bank of Australia official was saying in his answers to Senator Malcolm Roberts and Senator Jared Rennick in the second last hearing in Parliament, because they were emphasising that their cash survey, cash use survey that had shown for 2020 that by 2023 cash use had plummeted to an all-time low of 13%. He said that's only based on 1,000 people. You and I talked about this last time.
Yes.
But then he said, but we actually see through the other ways we measure it that the use of cash is ticking up. And he was referring to these ATM withdrawal figures. So if you're on a bank board, I reckon that your meetings in the last month or two have been pretty glum, because the banks definitely had cashless plans. Now, the quote that we use comes from middle of 2020. Channel 7 did a report after there was one national lockdown in COVID, remember? And so at the end of that, middle of the year, Channel 7 did this report on how the banks had achieved in 10 weeks cashless plans that they thought would take 5 years. And that tells you two things. One, they had plans, which now they're denying they have. Anna Bligh is running around the country now for the last month giving interviews saying, the banks have no plans to get rid of cash. Rubbish. They've definitely had plans to get rid of cash, and they've been caught out. Now they're trying to pretend they're not. They're in damage control. And the other thing it tells you is the banks had seized on, like all sort of despotic-minded people do, seized on the crisis of COVID as the opportunity. Let's ram this home. And of course, that's what they did. So I've been sort of enjoying the idea that in bank boards, there's been quite a lot of frowns in the last month or so. And I think some signs of you always look for the flack to know that you really are over the target. And there's two examples I can cite just in the last month or so where through the mainstream media, the banks have bit back. Now, the most recent one is sort of a bit of an interpretation of mine, but I'm pretty confident. Peter Van Onselen, and people might know, he's a well-known name in Australia, political editor of Channel 10. He's now moved on to he's now either been promoted or demoted to the Daily Mail. I don't know, however you choose to interpret that. But he wrote this column in the Australian a couple of weeks ago, in the Saturday Australian, attacking Senate inquiries on behalf of the Business Council of Australia. And go to the Business Council of Australia website. It's dominated by banks. The most important guy on there is Matt Comyn. The Business Council of Australia was complaining that these are bash up business exercises. Now, PVO didn't cite the banking inquiry. He cited the PwC inquiry, and he cited the supermarket retailers inquiry. But nevertheless, it was on behalf of the banks as well. And I'm sure they were helping to whip him up over this, because this inquiry, the branches inquiry, has given them a thorough flogging from one end of the country to the other. And the other bit of flack was the Financial Review Rear Window attack on Jason Bryce, and it was absolutely disgusting. And I know the Fin Review, this gossip column, Rear Window, I know it's used as an attack dog like this. Just, it's sort of like a paid service that the Fin Review provides to its corporate lords, because they attacked Jason and as the leader of Cash Welcome, and they attacked him based on the success of Cash Out Tuesday. But what really got me, first of all, they literally made up a quote that they attributed to him, and it was a totally made up thing. It was disgusting. But they come up with this concept of big ATM. They accused him and his Cash Welcome campaign of being funded by an ATM company, Next Payments. So that's one of the ATM companies where you get charged $2.50 or $3 or whatever. People, they're the ones that were kind of, because there's fewer bank ATMs anymore, you have to resort to using these kind of ATMs more and more. So this Next Payments does donate to Cash Welcome, and that settled it for Fin Review. That proved that Cash Welcome and Jason Bryce were financed by Big ATM. They called it Big ATM, and I'm thinking, hang on, here you got one ATM company, and I looked it up. Its profit for last year was $8.9 million versus the big four banks whose combined profit is $30 billion. And this propagandist at the AFR had the temerity to come up with a concept like there's big pharma, big oil, big whatever, big ATM. And I thought, that's like accusing David of representing Big Pebble against Goliath. And it's so desperate. It was so, but also disgusting. But that's an example, I think, where if we weren't having the success, you wouldn't have seen an attack like that. So, yeah, we said, I can distinctly remember, Martin, on the very first live show you and I did, we were talking in the wake of the cash ban, $10,000 cash ban campaign. And we said it's going to come down to use it or lose it. And there is this grassroots movement now across Australia where people have got that message. The using it is working. And we're well on the way to winning some big victories, I think. And just my final comment on this in general. I don't expect the Senate inquiry to recommend what we've lobbied for as the ultimate solution, which is another public bank. Bring back the public bank. And the reason I expect the final report to talk about the public bank option and the postal bank model that we've put forward. So that'll definitely be in there. There will be discussion about it, and there'll probably be some alternative comments or a dissenting report recommending it. But I doubt if the main report will recommend it, because there'll be all sorts of pressures brought to bear against doing that. But so I'm not going to hold the Senate report to that standard, as long as there's some other really strong stuff in there. The problem is that if we haven't got it through to them now, what we'll eventually get through to them is whatever all the other stuff they come up with, whatever it is, they're just setting up a conflict with the banks where the banks will throw all their lawyers at it and game whatever regulations they might be forced to comply with. And there's a case where Elisa Barwick, my wife, has just written for our magazine about she went through this recent UK parliamentary hearing on bank branches, where the headline that was in the paper was that they got these new banking hubs in the UK, and one of them has ended up in a public toilet of all places. But that is not working. And the dynamic, though, is the UK Parliament does actually want to bring in some tough rules here, but they haven't finalised them. And so the rules aren't in place yet. And because the banks know that's happening, they've just pulled out all the stops to close as many branches as possible. And that's what led to this hearing. And of course, that's what the banks do. So they're not going to be able to change their nature. They're going to treat whatever the Senate comes up with the same way they always have. And the only way, and eventually we'll get through to them, the only way you're actually going to bring these banks to heel is force them to compete with a public bank. And if we have our model of a public bank operating through every post office in Australia, 4,000 post offices, imagine them being the outlet of a public bank where your deposits are 100% safe, not 250 up to 250,000. All your deposits 100% safe. Your money is being reinvested in the communities across Australia. Plus, it's effectively a retail side of the Reserve Bank, and so it can give direct feedback to the Reserve Bank about how much cash is required out in those regions, and they can use the infrastructure of Australia Post to get it around, right, which is much more efficient than what they're doing now. That is a model that will work for everybody, and we will keep pushing that. And this cash movement, I think, will be wind in our sails, and eventually this will come to a head in Parliament.
Yeah, and just another shout out to Dale Webster, who did a lot of the preliminary work and a lot of the mapping to show the withdrawal of the banking services from all over the country. That was a really critical piece of journalism that she did, which was great. And my observation is, Robbie, that the question is, have the bankers got the politicians' throats, or have the politicians got the bankers' throats, right? Because I believe that there's actually significant contention now, right? If you look at a lot of the leaders of our political parties, they do seem to be rather well aligned to the financial services organisations. Many, have had jobs. Like Frydenberg was actually, inside the financial system. And you mentioned earlier on about the fact that a lot of the financial services companies pay lots of money to the political parties for favours, effectively, of course, but to both sides.
It's not charity. It's not charity.
They play both sides to the middle. But they also have massive lobbying capacity. And I can remember being down in Canberra some years ago, and I saw the herds of lobbyists all going after the politicians, right? Because the banks are actually very, very good at working on the inside rather than actually in the public sphere. And so, in a way, this Senate inquiry is not only getting a lot of flack from consumer land, but they're also behind the scenes getting a lot of flack from probably the banks directly, but also indirectly, because there are other politicians who are still, frankly, in the pockets of the banks pretty much. So that's why this is a really important, and come back to this propaganda point, right, which is what we're trying to touch on tonight. So behind the scenes, there is this question of, well, it's called the money power, I guess, but it's the financial system is designed to protect the financial system. The financial system is not necessarily designed to provide good services to consumers and to small businesses, right? And just a sort of a little bit of a sort of a segue, but it's also very relevant too. We had another bank failure, right? So in the US, guess what? Republic First Bank fell over, right? But it was sort of swept up and gobbled up by another bank. So effectively, the banking system looked after its own, but in the process, it's worth just noting, why did they struggle? They struggled because of the high interest rates that translate into unrealized losses on loans and securities, leading to the collapse last year, of course, of Silicon, Signature Bank and First Republic, when now we had another one. Side note, don't ever call your bank Republican First or First Republic. That's clearly no. But this was a really telling. This is actually from the Financial Times, which showed just how much the unrealized losses are sitting in the banks in the US, right? And this is because of the change in interest rates. So the financial system is really wobbly at the minute, right? Despite all of the talk about there's nothing to see here, right? And so we have regulators and we have central bankers worrying about financial stability. And even in Australia, all the talk has been about financial stability. But sacrificing financial stability at all costs means that consumers and businesses don't get the services that they need. They don't have the sort of banking that they need to protect what they're doing. And it's a fundamental point here, and this is where I want to lead the conversation to. The bank's agenda is not the same agenda as ordinary Australians.
No, they're a self-feeding entity now that's disconnected from what the purpose they exist for. Banking is supposed to be a financial service to the real economy. They have become the means and ends of their own existence, and so the people in the banks think that way. They think the customers serve them, right? They think they're just the sheep to be shorn for the sake of the banks, and that is the model now. It's a ticket clipping fleecing model. It is not. The old model of banking was, okay, I've got this capital, you've got an idea, you've got a proposal, I will help you achieve your idea, and I'll get something from that as well, right? So win-win. You achieve your objective, I get my cut out of that. This is not that. This is when they brought in. This started in the 90s. It's actually spelled out really well in Adele Ferguson's book. Commonwealth Bank pioneered it. All the banks started following, and that's where all the big they loaded people up with fees and the gouging system, etc. But it's not just in Australia; it's global. I mean, we don't have all the time in the world in this show, but we've said for a long time, Martin, 2008 was the day of reckoning, the time of reckoning. But what happened, instead of actually facing up to the problems and dealing with them in 2008, especially in the Western world, they propped up these failing banks and they kicked the can down the road. And then, that required all this extra money printing, and all, this massive increase in bond issuance. America has $34 trillion now in federal government debt. $34 trillion. It's unpayable by any measure. And eventually that started to do what it was always going to do, trigger inflation. And when the inflation hit, and the only way they know to deal with it is raise interest rates, suddenly you've got all these worthless assets. And so is the time of reckoning now? It would appear to be so. And that's where, in the name of financial stability, not only might they have, well, there's one of my favorite movies is Hunt for the Red October. And the pivotal scene in Hunt for the Red October is when, the Sean Connery character gets on the other ship, on the other submarine, and then it's the Russian submarine versus the American submarine, and they do all the fancy stuff, and the torpedoes are in the water, and they're chasing the American submarine. He pulls a move, and then the torpedoes lock onto the Russian submarine they came from. And the second in command says to his captain, "You idiot! You've got us all killed." And in economic terms, financial terms, that is what we are getting into. And we're also getting into it in action, and I would argue in military terms as well, because this economic reality of a sinking Atlantic financial system, transatlantic financial system, which Australia is plugged into, this economic reality is what's driving the military tensions facing the world, and one or the other is going to blow up.
Right, and that's a very, very good segue, because we've talked about the propaganda in and around the financial system, right, and the messages that are actually being filtered out, which are actually not reality. But there's a broader set of those same trends, and I boil it back to, we are now in a pre-war environment. Now, that has been something I think was said a couple of years ago in Australia. We've had ex-military people in the UK say it. We've had European leaders say it as well. And it's almost like everybody is now being conditioned to think that war is inevitable, right? And therefore we need to actually position for war. And every time I hear that, I think, okay, who's saying it? Why are they saying it? And what is the propagandist agenda that's driving it? Because you can talk yourself into a conflict.
Yep.
And I worry that we are normalizing to expect a conflict. And that's a really serious question. So I guess my sort of line of thought is, where does it come from? Where does it really come from, right? And postscript, who benefits, right? Because, of course, the people who benefit are the big commercial entities who are manufacturing war machinery for anybody who buys it.
Well, there was so a couple of shorthand questions first, and then we get into it a bit more in depth. But there's there was an American general in the 1930s, General Smedley Butler, who actually went public with the fact that he was approached to run a coup against Franklin Roosevelt, and his famous line was, "War is a racket." There's another line, all wars are bankers' wars, which there's a fair amount of truth there. And then, of course, you do have what you just referenced, especially in the post-World War II era, what an American president, and not just any American president, the hero of World War II, Dwight D. Eisenhower, he felt so strongly about this, he made it a warning of his farewell address, warning about guarding against the rise of the military-industrial complex. Well, his warning fell on deaf ears, because that is the game. I mean, there's so much money now that goes into the business of war. That is what drives the inevitability of war to a large degree, but not totally. And I think it's looking at the overarching picture that people need to consider. The last time you and I had a discussion like this, Martin, was actually 2 years ago, because we, the tensions between Russia and Ukraine were spiraling, and you said, let's get on, do a quick show and talk about that, right? And in the 2 years since, a lot has happened, and I think it's quite instructive to sort of reflect on what's transpired, but also the increase in tensions around the world, because you see, if you're paying attention, I would argue you actually see the propaganda, the role propaganda has played in all this. But you also see, if you can also see there is evidence on which you can discern the truth of it, right? So anyway, so let's discuss some of that. I just want to make an overarching point, though, because part of the dynamic is explained, or some people explain, by this theory called the Thucydides trap. And you could think of it in these terms. So the Thucydides trap was based on the Thucydides history of the Peloponnesian War, right, where the established power goes to war against the rising power. Greece, Athens went to war against Sparta. And the trap is this idea that there's a certain inevitability to that. And it's always the declining established power that initiates the war, not the rising power. It's always the declining established power. Now, so I think there is some reality to that. And in very broad terms, we're talking about the United States and China. But you're not actually just talking about the United States and China. What you're now starting to talk about is the systems that they represent, which are very different. And I would argue it's not so simple as the Thucydides trap. And the evidence I have for that is what's actually transpired in recent times in front of our eyes as this conflict has grown. And my example is, take the systems clash idea of what China and America represent. So it's China in its dealing in the organization groupings it's part of, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which involves Russia as well, and a whole bunch of Eurasia. It's got the bigger one, like probably the most significant one, is the BRICS formation, right? That's definitely representing a new system and a new orientation. And of course, America represents the transatlantic, so Anglo-American European system, right? And these are the systems that are starting to clash, even though they're intertwined and they've got to trade with each other. The sense of priorities and what they want their system to be is what's starting to clash. And the reason I don't think it's as simple as the Thucydides trap is because as China has grown spectacularly in the last 15 years, there are numerous examples where China has sought to include the United States in the initiatives it's taking, whereas at every turn, America has sought to block China from participating in its initiatives. And these are the main economic ones. So things like like Obama excluded China from the Trans-Pacific Partnership before Trump came along and ripped up America's role in it anyway. But they had we tend to put a lot of blame on Trump because of Trump. He's a big bombastic guy. People sort of forget what happened before him. No, Obama excluded China from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Yet every initiative China took, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, China invited everyone to join, including the United States, and America said no. And actually, with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, America ordered Australia to say no. And one of the last acts of actual independence and sovereignty that I've seen in our foreign policy was when Tony Abbott in 2015 accepted the invitation and joined anyway over America's objections. So there's a big difference. The Belt and Road Initiative, China invited the whole world to participate, including the United States. And the United States has tried to characterize Belt and Road, which is literally just a commitment to build infrastructure like ports and railways to make the thing the lifeblood of the world economy, trade, more efficient. That's what Belt and Road is. And the nations who participate in that benefit from those increased efficiencies. China invited everyone. America said no, and America turned around and tried to demonize it as some kind of threat. Whereas, if all these things that America sniped at China about over the Belt and Road, if America had participated as China invited them to, it could have been there as the other big player. And if they were real problems, it could have been guarding against those problems, right? But no, instead of doing that, it's sniped. And so you've got one side of the equation here that's actually in my view, trying to be inclusive, and the other side is just doing everything it can. And this is more from a Thucydides trap idea. Oh, we're going to crush this rising power because we cannot contemplate a world in which we don't remain the sole power. And so so what would drive that? And this is where your question was going. So my view, and from this is not just a guess, this is from a lot of work. Let me put it this way. And I'm appealing to your listeners now who are watching this, right? So whatever your view of Robbie Barwick and China is, Cookie Boy, who dubbed me Chairman Barwick Mao, the reason you are a regular on DFA is because you have real issues with the way the economy in Australia is run. And I think there's a broad agreement that we're run by this elitist banking system, as we just spent the last, 3/4 of an hour talking about, that is running the system to serve itself, not to serve us. And that there is the system that the transatlantic powers are trying to maintain. It's a City of London, Wall Street system where the military powers, the empire is a financial one, the City of London and Wall Street, with all the tools of the international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, etc., but it's enforced by military might. That's the system. It is not, there's nothing new about it. It's an old imperial model. It was the British Empire, and the British then folded the British, we have a very strong informed view. The British saw that the post-war world would be more a case of British brains and American brawn. They could have all the benefits of empire financially and let the Americans do all the cost, wear all the cost of enforcement in the name of keeping the world, keeping the world safe from communism and all this kind of rubbish that they convinced themselves for all those years. And that's the system that they're trying to maintain. And so it's not in the interests of the average Australian, and certainly not the average American or the average Brit. We never benefit from this system. We never have. There was a British writer in the 1880s, 1890s named, I think his name was Hobson, who caused an enormous hullabaloo when he wrote a book then about the British Empire, pointing out to his fellow Brits, hey, this thing called the Empire we're so proud of, the sun never sets on our empire. What do we get out of it? Right? SFA, nothing. It all goes into this aristocratic elite who run the UK, who still run the UK, frankly. And that's the model that they're trying to protect. And so it's not just a case of like a racist white superiority thing. Oh, we can't let the yellow races rule the world. It's not just that, though. I think a little bit of that comes into it. They're trying to protect the system, because then look at actually what the Chinese are doing, what the dare I say it, even the Russians are doing, not nowhere near as well as the Chinese, though. But more importantly, why the world is looking to China in a way that most people in a Western country wouldn't understand. And I want to cite the great Kishore Mahbubani on this. Now, if you're a bit of a Robbie Barwick skeptic and you're not that convinced on my view on China, I encourage you to look up Kishore Mahbubani, who is the former Singaporean ambassador to the United Nations, and just listen to some of his speeches on this subject. These Singaporeans are pretty smart guys. They are the bridge between East and West in many senses. And he's used to talking to an American and European audience, Keyshaw, but he's one of the best spokesmen for actually trying to show the world, hey, look, this is what really China is doing, not what you think it's doing. This is what it's actually doing. But he has a more fundamental point, Martin, which is that 85% of the world like what China's doing. The same 85% of the world, by the way, don't condemn what Russia's doing. Very important. They don't sanction Russia. They understand I think we should get into that a bit in a minute, but they understand there's a nuanced understanding of what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. They don't have politicians saying every time they open their mouth about Russia, the unprovoked immoral war on Ukraine. Like our politicians, they're not allowed to say the word Russia or say the war on Ukraine. They've got to say the unprovoked immoral war on Ukraine, as opposed to our war in Iraq. That was provoked and moral. It must be, because they never call it that. But for Russia, it's always the unprovoked immoral war on Ukraine. Instead of us, you and I debating that, just take note of the fact that 85% of the world doesn't think that way. 85% of the world is keen to do business with China. There's a whole bunch of videos nowadays, thanks to the power of the internet, where you can see the African leaders, African leader after African leader after African leader, taking on European leaders and American leaders who've gone there to lecture them, and they keep interrupting them and say, "What are you coming here to lecture us for about China? China never comes here to lecture us about you. China comes here to talk about business. Every time you guys come here, all you want to do is lecture us." That's why Africa. What does Africa want? It wants to develop. They're the most looted place in the world, in the history of the world. It wants to develop. That's why it's looking at China differently. That's why That's why the BRICS has grown, et cetera, et cetera. And when you look at the actual structures, in those structures, especially in the Chinese system, there's not corporations that rule the world, right? The governments have the corporations under control, whereas we have a system which we can all agree the corporations here rule the governments, and that is a shorthand way of describing the clash between the two systems, and that's why the propaganda. That's why they can't let this go and just look at the reality of the world and say, okay, let's have a multipolar world where we can all get along. No. They have to protect their position at the top of the pile, the way they see it, and they will go to war and provoke a world war if necessary to do that, which will be the doom for us all.
And Robbie, I think I want to bring here the idea of dollar hegemony, right? Because effectively, up until relatively recently, the bulk of international trade was all determined by the dollar. We've already seen some of the impact of a very strong dollar. Look at the Chinese yen today relative to the dollar. There are concerns at some high levels, particularly in the US and elsewhere, that maybe the power of the dollar is diminishing. And I guess BRICS is a little bit of a sign of that. So there is almost a direct line between maintaining the strength of the dollar, maintaining the strength of the corporates that sort of live behind that, and then policy that follows from it. And so when you actually start thinking about, well, why are people saying and doing what they're saying and doing, there is actually an agenda behind that. And it's this agenda of maintaining the status quo and maintaining the power and autonomy of a relatively small proportion of the total world population, right, in the number one slot, which is actually driving a lot of this. But I want to come back to this other point. And a lot of the financial system and a lot of the military manufacturing capability is living off the back of that dollar hegemony.
Well, it's quite a ride the American economy has had with its dollar hegemony. And if you know the origins of it, it was the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 71, and the dollar was really precarious then, but then the Americans rescued it by doing this agreement with Saudi Arabia and the oil countries to create the petrodollar. And that's what we've had ever since. And when you got dollar hegemony, what America has essentially been able to do is outsource its inflation. They've been able to, they can print all this money, and they don't notice it showing up in inflation because everyone's using the dollar around the world. But because going hand in hand with that, they actually couldn't accept the rise of other countries, such as the rise of China, or even acknowledge the Russians' right to their own sense of national interest, and that's a big part of the story as well. Because the Russians, smarter people all through the 90s after the Cold War, smarter people said, hang on, the way we're treating Russia here, this is going to end in tears. It's going to end in a war if we keep expanding. I became friends with Malcolm Fraser in his final years. He was one of the senior statesmen around the world who says NATO should have been disbanded after the wall came down. That was its purpose. It was done. In a peaceful world without the divide between communism and capitalism, there's no purpose for NATO. But instead of doing that, the Americans and the British expanded it right up to Russia's doorstep. And the smarter people, Americans and Paul Keating was one of them, Malcolm Fraser, another one, said this is going to end in tears. And it's ended exactly the way that they predicted it would. But in the course of doing that, they came up with this concept, the rules-based order, and the Americans started sanctioning every Tom, Dick, and Harry in terms of countries who didn't abide by their rules, sanctioning with what? With the power of the dollar, with cutting them off from the SWIFT system and all that sort of stuff. And, Vladimir Putin has pointed this out repeatedly. The one thing that underpins American power, which is its dollar, in order to flex its muscles with its power, it was undoing, because it was showing the world, well, we will use this to punish people. And so when the Chinese said, well, and the BRICS countries started saying, well, let's come up with alternatives to the dollar, people started to jump at it, right? So the BRICS group is working on a trading currency, an international trading currency just for trade, which someone has suggested it be dubbed the 5 R's, because it's proposed to be a basket basically made up of the 5 currencies of the founding BRICS countries, and they all start with R: the ruble, the renminbi, the real, and I'm sorry, the rupee, etc. Anyway, whatever I've missed one there. The rand. There you go. The brains trust is at least she's paying attention to me, even if it's to make sure I don't stuff up. So that's been one suggestion, but the idea is to have not as a replacement for national currencies. They don't want to do that, but have it as a rival to the US dollar hegemony, as the trading currency, where all the countries of the world can say, oh, we don't just have to take the US dollar because that's the most convertible, and it's the world's reserve currency. This one's going to be pretty widely accepted as well, and increasingly so, right? And a lot of the motivation for that was political, because the Americas couldn't help themselves and just ran around sanctioning everybody, taking away, here's look at the way Russia was punished financially for the Iraq war, for the Ukraine war, and then ask yourself, where was our punishment for the Iraq war? Why was the Iraq war more justified than the Ukraine war? Because we did it. Nobody punished us. America had no punishment. Australia had no punishment. But then, because we are the enforcers of this rules-based order based on rules that we make up, not international law, the rules-based order, then we're doing all this sanctioning. And this is going to go down in history if it gets to be written. And the reason I said that is because I did watch Oppenheimer the other week. And if it gets to be written, this is going to go down in history as the greatest act of self-sabotage of any empire ever, what America has done to undermine its own dollar hegemony. And now the thing that really saved America's butt in 2008 was the Chinese stepping in financially to back up the American economy, and that included buying a huge amount of American bonds. Well, some of you listeners, viewers would probably already know this, but of recent times, China has been systematically selling down its bonds, its US bonds, and it's now down to about, my understanding is around 800 billion US bonds. So there's now more talk in America, increasing talk about America defaulting on just the Chinese bonds, selective default on its bonds. And then Anthony Blinken has just gone to China, and he had all these demands for China to stop trading with Russia, because contrary to what we were told for 2 years, Russia is winning the war in Ukraine. We were being told Russia's losing. It never was. It was always winning, and it's definitely, no one can deny that now. So America stopped pretending Russia's not winning. And so it's saying to China, Russia's winning because you're trading with it. You're not trading weapons. You're trading, industrial goods that they can use to manufacture weapons. You got to stop doing that, or else, right? And what does the or else mean? And if that means some kind of if they're getting to the brink of potentially thinking about a default on US government bonds owned by China, that would be not self-sabotage, that would be suicide. Because the minute the whole world sees that, this 85% of the world, that's the end of the US dollar. It's all over. There would be zero trust left in the American system after that. And you're just left scratching your head thinking, who are the lunatics running this asylum? Seriously. And that's where I feel a responsibility, Martin, as someone in a country like Australia, which is a close ally of the United States, to get our country on track so that we can, as a friend of America, talk sense to them and say, cut it out. The world doesn't have to be this way. Let's not take it to the brink. Let's work out arrangements where we can all get along, please.
Right. Well, talking about arrangements to let us all get along, 380 billion or thereabouts is the number. AUKUS is the name. And it's interesting that people like Keating and Helen Clark from New Zealand have a very different perspective from what our mainstream politicians have been saying about this very fine long-term deal with Australia and the US to protect the long-term interests of Australia.
Yes. So let's respond to that by making an observation, Martin. And the observation is this. Why do so many former politicians talk so much sense? And they never talk this much sense when they were actually in politics. And I think that tells you something about our system, actually. There are secret forces that get brought to, when I say secret, I mean, invisible to the public. We don't get to know what they are. But they get brought to bear on the people when they're in office that make them act in a certain way. And once they're free from that, you tend to see a bit more independent thinking. And I've seen a lot of that. And, one example, though I don't judge him as much on this, but Malcolm Fraser was definitely one of those people. But so the latest one is Helen Clark and Paul Keating. So they had this thing a couple of weeks ago at the New Zealand Parliament. And what I found extraordinary about Helen Clark's speech is she was talking about AUKUS, because AUKUS, New Zealand's been encouraged to join what they call AUKUS Pillar 2. So not the nuclear submarines, which is going to cost us $380 billion, but industrial stuff that will feed that and whatever. The problem for New Zealand is that for 40 years, they actually have had what we haven't had, which is an independent foreign policy, and proudly so, because they've had they made a commitment to nuclear disarmament, and that brought them into conflict with the United States. And so New Zealand was essentially kicked out of ANZUS back in 1986. And Helen Clark addressed all this. And in the intervening years, New Zealand has had this political commitment to its independent foreign policy, but undermining that, New Zealand's also been part of Five Eyes. And so its intelligence agencies have been operating hand in glove with the actual, what I think is the source of that secret pressure on politicians, this supranational spy network, Five Eyes intelligence network, which is out of the limelight, is most politicians, unlike the first politicians like Ben Chifley, who was Prime Minister when ASIO started, he didn't want to have a bar of ASIO and he was kind of grudgingly talked into it. And when ASA started, which is our foreign spy agency, in 52, by 56, the Menzies cabinet wanted to shut it down. Politicians in Australia today, or New Zealand or America, they would never say that about. They would all feel intimidated and submissive to ASIO and the CIA and MI6, etc. Those agencies are a power above the political structure, and they actually are. And I think it's one of the great evils in the world how we set up these permanent secretive intelligence agencies in the name, of course. There's always everything's justified, always justified by whatever, right? But this has become a mechanism, and New Zealand had this, always undermining the New Zealand government to stay in lockstep with its Five Eyes partners. And I interviewed Matt Robson, the former Associate Foreign Minister, who told me what it was like always dealing with the pressure of Five Eyes in New Zealand, even though they wanted to have a different policy. The democratic policy wanted to be different. So there was a struggle. So Helen Clark described some of that. One of the things she described is the New Zealand having an independent position on the Iraq War. They didn't join the Iraq War. They did send some troops a little bit later for reconstruction, but they weren't part of the invasion. They didn't want to have a bar of it. She said it remains one of the best decisions they've ever made. But she was made to pay for that. I mean, there was a famous story a few months after the invasion. She was subjected to a explosive search in the Sydney airport, even though she's the Prime Minister of a country. And I know the New Zealand government took it. They knew it was a deliberate slight on New Zealand this was by the Howard government for New Zealand making them, taking a different position to them. And they knew that. But anyway, so she's dealt with that. But now what's happening is New Zealand is being drawn in to this AUKUS thing. It's being drawn into the NATO arrangements. It started with Jacinda Ardern and it's continued with this guy. And so she gave a speech on that. And because she got to do it from the standpoint of actually having an independent foreign policy, which they're losing, which is a perspective Australia doesn't have, it was quite fascinating. And what I loved about the speech is she ridiculed the things that I ridicule. So that's why I'm talking about it, because I agree with it. But people might not take it seriously from me, but she was the Prime Minister. And so she ridiculed things like the claim that China's hacked the parliament. She just ridiculed it. I know this stuff is mostly made up because we'll never have to prove it. They get to jump and dance like banshees about it, and we're supposed to, we've been hacked again. She just ridiculed it, right? She said, what secrets does the parliament have anyway? She ridiculed this term Indo-Pacific, Martin, which made me love her. I'm thinking, no one heard the term Indo-Pacific before 5 years ago. It wasn't a thing. It did not exist. Suddenly, Indo-Pacific. We grew up being taught using the term Asia-Pacific. But the Americans said, no, we're going to say Indo-Pacific, because what they wanted to do is change our frame of reference. And that's what she said. It's just a propaganda term. In fact, she used that word, right? This is a propaganda term that they've come up with. And as the former ambassador to Iran and the deputy ambassador to China for Australia, John Lander, made a point at one of our events, there is only actually one Indo-Pacific country, and that's Australia. We've got the Pacific on one side, the Indian Ocean on the other side. So when the Americans are saying Indo-Pacific, they're actually talking about their control of us, because they do have this enormous control of us. But go look at her speech. It's on YouTube. If you want to see a perspective that is refreshingly blunt to say, look, from a standpoint of a country that actually values an independent foreign policy, this is not the way to go. The America and China are both great powers in the region. We should do business with both of them. We should not blame one or the other. We should not side with one or the other. And the other thing she ridiculed is the threat. Where is the threat? China is no threat to us. Go watch the Utopia clip if you haven't seen it. The ABC TV show Utopia, where the Rob Sitch character has got all the generals there asking him, why are we, are you saying we're going to spend $400 billion on submarines so we can protect our trade routes with China from China? Right? That is how it's no more sophisticated than that. That's how bizarre it is. And the problem is, when you've got the media and the mainstream political parties and the establishment all kowtowing to this agenda, they can make, anyone who's the emperor, the little boy saying the emperor's got no clothes is a lone voice, right? But the emperor does have no clothes. And now Helen Clark has added her voice to the people who are saying that. And I think it's increasingly powerful, and let's hope it works.
Well, yes, I think it was a very important contribution to the debate. And, I've always had the view that Australia should be a little less strongly connected to the US at the cost of everything else, right? So there will be times when it's appropriate to be closely aligned with what the US is doing, but to be in their pocket to the point where we don't have politicians in Australia who can think independently from what the US is thinking is a considerable concern. And I've seen that develop the wrong way over recent years. So it almost is like we don't have any independence of thought. We don't have any independence of position. We actually have to just roll over and the lapdog or whatever you want to call it, as some of the cartoonists have shown it.
We don't even advocate breaking with the US. But like the saying, friends don't let friends drive drunk. Be sovereign though. Right. So what we're doing is we're running on the fumes of a proper alliance that we started in World War II, which was a just and proper alliance, and that was to deal with a real threat. And ever since then, in the name of that, we've turned it into this abomination. And the worst part is we have given up our sovereignty, our agency as a country, to turn ourselves into this massive US base. And now we're about to spend $368 billion on submarines to talk ourselves into fighting a war against an enemy that's actually our best trading partner. I mean, it's absolutely bizarre. The Liberal Party in Western Australia, and I took great exception to this and I wrote about it for Michael West Media, the Liberal Party has just pre-selected a candidate over there for the seat of Tangney, Mark Wales, who's written a book about a Chinese invasion of Australia in 2034 or whatever. And that's the normalization of this idea. And there never has been any intent, like any evidence of any threat from China to invade Australia. The other day, I saw a map that I'd seen I remember seeing it as a kid, and it was just American propaganda illustration from the 60s where it's a map of Australia and it's like a cartoon, and the caption goes, "This is what's being taught in Chinese schools," and the map says New China. And there was never a map in China that labeled Australia New China. Never, ever, ever. Liars in America made it up so they could talk us into joining their crime called the Vietnam War. Right? But they keep doing this, and you've got to think, well, where does it end? And then, Martin, sorry about this, but I've got to say this because part of this package is the propaganda is moralizing. We are supposedly morally superior to these countries that we're going after. We're morally superior to Iraq. Iraq was this terrible. We had all the reasons in the world to invade Iraq. We're morally superior to China because it's an authoritarian country that commits human rights abuses. That's what we've been told. And one of the ones that I've talked about on your show that I've taken on quite forcefully is the claims of what China's supposedly doing to the Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang autonomous region in Western China there, which the Americans labeled genocide. It's officially classified as genocide in America, but not one person has died. Not one. Yet we are now witnessing in Technicolor for all the world to see in Gaza what our moral superiority actually stands for. Because here you have the slaughter of 15,000 babies, 30,000 plus people, most of them civilian, but 15,000 kids. And that's not genocide. Israel has a right to defend itself against the people that it's occupying.
That's what our system is saying. That's what the American system is saying. And to me, if you don't get it yet, that this is the proof that that was all BS, and as if America ever cared about Muslims in blooming Xinjiang anyway. But if you don't get it yet, I can't help you. There's the contrast for you. And there's a particular senator in America named Tom Cotton, one of these ex-military types, who is as big a racist prick as any of them in there, totally all the way with Israel and Gaza. And he's the guy who last month put the CEO of TikTok on the mat. And he did this totally McCarthyite hearing where he said, "Are you a member of the Chinese Communist Party?" And the CEO of TikTok said, "Well, no, I'm Singaporean." "Yeah, but are you a member of the Chinese Communist Party?" "No, Senator, I'm from Singapore." Right? Not a member of the Chinese Communist Party. Like, this was straight out of Joe McCarthy. But then he had this list of things that do you accept there was a massacre at Tiananmen Square? Do you accept the American government's designation that there's genocide in Xinjiang? And when I heard him saying that, now with everything that's happening in Gaza, that he denies and everybody of his ilk denies as a genocide, but they're still doubling down on what's happening in Xinjiang, which has killed nobody, is a genocide, then it is that lunatic. It is that ludicrous. They are taking the piss that much. That is the nature of propaganda. You don't tell little lies, you tell big lies. The little lies don't get believed. The big lies do get believed. It's Goebbelian. Is that how you say that, by the way? Whatever, Goebbels invented. It's Goebbelian. If no one else has made up that term, I have. That's what we're dealing with. And then the moral responsibility is on us as individuals. Because are we going to choose to keep believing that and siding with the side that is feeding us that stuff and drawing us into more and more wars? Or are we going to say, no, okay, something's gone badly wrong with our country here. I'm going to do what I can to change it.
Right. And Robbie, as I come towards the last 10 minutes of the show, there's another angle to this propaganda, right? Because in Australia, we have at the moment a digital ID bill, which is halfway through the parliament. We have effectively a bill that is really strangling free speech, particularly on social media. In other words, who's going to determine what truth can be actually heard? And a few other things going on in the background, all of which is making it more and more difficult to even have these sorts of conversations.
That's the intention. So, just on the misinformation, disinformation one, because that's, I think, become quite transparent in the last few weeks, that it's clearly a nefarious agenda, because, of course, they're never going to present this honestly as a nefarious agenda. It's always for our own good, right? And so what, the claim was, especially in COVID, there was all this misinformation, disinformation that was harmful, and all this comes down to definitions. And that's why we need a bill to rein in social media. But then, of course, the bill itself is quite transparent. They exclude from, as sources of misinformation, they exclude the government. So the government cannot be a source of misinformation, disinformation, even though the government, we could spend hours on the lies of the governments over the years. And they exclude the mainstream media, as if the mainstream media isn't a source of misinformation or disinformation. So this is literally at social media. And to be honest, we would have had nowhere near the effect that we've had, that we're able to spend the first 3/4 of an hour talking about in terms of domestic policy and trying to shift things domestically in Australia without social media. We're on social media now, right? If you bring in a power where you can censor this in the name of shutting down misinformation, disinformation that is harmful, well, what are the limitations on that power? Because it always comes down to definitions, like I said. And it's the reason that this issue, which has been debated for centuries, it's been debated. Should there be limits or not on free speech? Over time, starting with the Enlightenment and then coming forward and frankly, climaxing in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. You can sort of see it as a consensus because the world agreed to that declaration of free speech through any medium. By the way it's written, actually go and look at it. It's worth looking at. The language is clear. There shouldn't be, government shouldn't accept limitations on this through whatever medium or channel as well. So they left the scope open for future media such as social media. The consensus was there are greater harms in limiting free speech than the dangers that may come from free speech, because there are dangers. I accept that. I've seen lots of crazy claims running around, and they can get dangerous. I understand that. Like this has never been without risk, but the risk of what happens if you constrain it is far greater. Now, and then on top of that, what I was going to say earlier, it's self-serving. This is to allow the government and not just when I say the government, be clear, the two major parties actually, mostly, because they're the ones that are on this 30% vote now. And what are they doing? Instead of looking at that 30% vote total and saying, this means we're on the nose, this means collapsing government is at an all-time low. This is existential now. The trust in government is in an existential collapse. Therefore, we better change what we're doing to win that trust back. Instead of saying that, because that would involve taking on the corporate vested interests that they are allowing to loot us, they're turning around and saying, oh, well, that can't be the explanation. It must be misinformation, disinformation. And wherever you stand on Trump, the petri dish was what happened to Trump in 2016, because he got elected for a reason, not because he was some great guy, but because Americans were so jaded and so pissed with what the two major parties usually offered. And Michael Moore, the filmmaker, actually, he has you can look it up, a really powerful outburst he made before the election saying, you got no idea, all these people used to live in these industrial centers in the Midwest, who were the people who were the industrial backbone of America, who now have no future. They're going to vote for this guy just to blow up the system. I'm warning you. And he was absolutely right. But instead of the American establishment acknowledging that, what did they do? They turned around and said, Russian interference in the election. Can't be us. We're going to blame someone else. And frankly, that kind of mentality is what's it's not just led to rubbish policies like this. It's actually what's helped to lead to the Russia-Ukraine war. So it's very dangerous. The part I think where they've exposed themselves is last year they did the exposure draft of the bill, and that goes to a normal consultation. And there was a massive blowback in the consultation process, enormous flood of objections, and across the spectrum, including from the Human Rights Council and the Law Council. And they point out, look, it comes down to definitions. It comes down to how do you define misinformation? How do you define disinformation? How do you define harmful? It comes down to those sort of things. So now we've got this debate about the video of the stabbing of Bishop Mari Emanuel. We've got to get that off the internet because that's harmful. But then an experienced journalist like Paul Barry on Media Watch last night points out, well, in all the things he's ever seen, it's nowhere near the worst of what's available on the internet now. The bishop didn't die. The bishop has said he doesn't want it taken down, right? But why did the government make a big deal about that video? Because they had such a blowback to the exposure draft of this bill last year that they parked it and said, we'll look at it again. In the meantime, the communications minister, Michelle Rowland, has been representing Australia at events all around the world, especially in Europe, where the European Union, because it is actually fundamentally anti-democratic and they can push sort of stuff through, the European Union has very strong powers this way. And Michelle's saying, this has to be international. It's got to be global. We're going to sign up to that. So they're always looking for an opportunity, is the actual truth. We can see that now because as soon as this stabbing happened, straight away, we need the misinformation, disinformation bill. It's like they pushed a button and it was ready to go. And that is actually frightening, the way they were just waiting for an opportunity so they can, instead of maybe letting the bill die a quiet death, right? And say, okay, yeah, that for political purposes, why would we want to go? The people don't want it. They can seize on it. And the other thing that tells you is the opposition's in on this. They actually are, because Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison started the process towards this bill, and Labor has continued it. Now, Peter Dutton has made some comments in the last week or so where he sounds like he's trying to distance himself from the government, especially over this idea that we should police the entire global internet from Australia. So he's criticised that, but the test will be how they actually come down on the misinformation, disinformation bill. Because if the two major parties stitch it up and get it through, that it will be a self-serving exercise to save their political butts, and we will be in the firing line. So we've got to intervene now on that, guys. If they chuck it into Parliament, it should have to go to a Senate inquiry, and that will be an opportunity to flood that with more objections, and now start calling your members of Parliament anyway and saying you better not support this idea of censoring social media, right? Because the dangers that come with that far outweigh whatever harms you think you might be minimising.
Yeah, and you made an interesting point there, and I want to just come back to the idea of people within government actually effectively inserting themselves into some of these debates. I'm thinking specifically of the ASIC review that's currently going on with Senator Bragg, right? And that's due to report relatively soon. But it's interesting that elsewhere in the government, ASIC has now been given effectively a chance to write, a 50-page submission before this other one comes out. It's almost like over there, another part of government is effectively trying to manipulate the story to make it more acceptable to ASIC vis-a-vis everybody else. So once again, what we see is a propaganda thing going on here to try and actually derail what otherwise would be a very, very important discussion about the role and future of ASIC.
Yeah, 100%. And I think this is an instructive example because it proves the point that this combine of the two major parties is, under the thumb of these banks' invested interests. And that is why, despite plummeting down to 30% in the votes, they're sticking to that instead of actually changing their policies to give the public what they want. Because just take the question of banks, take the question of ASIC, take the question of financial victims, right? When Labor was in opposition, that's when you had the big inquiries. You had a 2014 inquiry into ASIC. And the reason they had an inquiry into ASIC then is because it was letting down financial victims. You had the 2018 Banking Royal Commission. And I spoke to so many financial victims in those days. And to a man and woman, they all believed that Labor had back. That if Labor got elected, there would be massive changes. Claire O'Neill was the shadow minister on these matters, and financial victims thought she was a champion. Well, now they're in government. And what are they doing? I mean, I think Albo is frankly turned the whole country against him, because instead of getting into government and saying, we're going to do some big things here to actually deliver for people, he's wasted a lot of time on symbolic stuff. And something like this, which is a no-brainer, they took a strong position, deliver on it. Right? The Liberals were never going to take the banks in hand. Labor, you're not going to lose one vote taken on the banks. This is what's mind-blowing about this. You're not going to lose one vote taken on the banks, right? You're going to get the country behind you. So, John Adams gets this inquiry going into ASIC because he exposes their unwillingness to enforce the law. So that Senate inquiry has been quite powerful and going along well. And then out of the blue, this week, the alternative committee in the Parliament, which is chaired by a Labor senator, has invited ASIC to make a submission, and it's a 50-page submission explaining why, look, we've made all these internal reforms, and it's all to preempt the Senate inquiry. We've made all these internal reforms, nothing to see here, it's all good. And the only reason, it's an exercise that the Labor Party has done so that they can point to that and say, yep, that's that. We don't have any responsibility to this ASIC inquiry now. There's nothing. It's all done. It's all taken care of. And of course, nothing's taken care of. The same dysfunctional law enforcement and or lack of law enforcement will be what rules the day, because that's what the banks want. And this is Labor delivering to them. And it's so shameless the way they're submissive to these corporations like this. And so that's where the people have got to get fired up, right? Because we've got to, we are many, they are few, as Percy Shelley, the poet, said. We have to use that, and we have to, they got to politically change or die politically, right? Politically, don't misinterpret what I said there. They've got to change, or they're going to cease to exist as institutions, and they've got to be replaced, because the government has to serve the people, and we're going to make that change one way or the other, because this is our country's future at stake.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are pretty much out of time, probably running slightly over, Robbie, but I think we touched some big and important issues today. I mean, my take out of all of this is that when you hear things being said, particularly if you read it in the mainstream media or elsewhere, or if we hear what politicians are saying, just do a second take and ask, well, why are they saying what they're saying? What is the agenda that's behind the scenes, as it were? And to what extent is there an agenda that is actually not explicit but implicit, which could actually be counter to the interests of ordinary Australians or ordinary people around the world? Because I come back to this fundamental point. It seems to me that the political system and the financial system should be there to support the well-being of ordinary Australians, right, in Australia and other people around the world. They shouldn't be there to essentially bolster the position of big corporates or big business. They shouldn't be there just to, protect the status quo for the sake of the status quo. There is actually a very, very important point. And the question is the current political system and the current way of thinking actually benefiting ordinary people or not? And if not, we've got to change it.
Yep. And that's a good way of expressing what the Citizens Party is committed to. People first, return power to the people, but not just in a rabble, and not the mob, in terms of what truly benefits the people, and the people come forward, citizens come forward, take responsibility for their own nation, etc. And I want, if I can leave people on one thought, to say, because we talked about two broad subjects today, domestic economic policy as it relates to banks, etc., and global foreign policy. And just think about this thing I said, where the very thing we're fighting in Australia, which is probably the main reason we're on this show tonight, because we have a broad agreement that this economic system is letting us down. Think about that in global terms, because then you'll find that actually that is what defines the global conflict as well. And that's when you can start making judgments about which side has a better case, which side represents a better future. And unfortunately, my view is I don't think we're in it. We're in the 15% that has decided that right now we're going down with the ship. The 85% of the world is saying we don't want a part of that, thanks. We want a future where we can invest in infrastructure, where we can raise living standards, where we can see actual results. While our national income was smashed last year, China's national income went up 6%. That's what the people of China are sharing in terms of actual income, because they've got manufacturing, they've got state banks that invest in industry. They have a focus on infrastructure and raising living standards. And we used to do all that. And so we've got a choice. Do we turn around and demonize China for doing something that's we used to do and we should be doing ourselves again? Or do we say, well, okay, let's go back to doing that ourselves as well? And hey, there's grounds for collaboration. We can get on instead of this talk of war.
Robbie, thank you very much for that and for your contribution tonight. Greatly appreciated. We'll put some links and things below if people want to find more about the Citizens Party. And they put out regular publications. You've, of course, got your own YouTube channel as well. And, people, if you want to know more about what they're up to, go over to check that out. There's some good stuff on there, as well as the regular weeklies. They also do one-off interviews, which are always worth following through on as well. Robbie, thank you very much. Really appreciate it, and I'm
Thanks,
sure we'll
Martin.
catch up again down the road. Look forward to that. But in the meantime, I'll take you offline, and I'll just close the show. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
So there you go, folks. Thank you very much, and thanks for all the comments. And Jason, thank you for your super chat. Really appreciate it. And yeah, you make an important point. This is about different opinions and viewpoints. It's not about an argument. It's not about me pulling Robbie apart or whatever. This is about hearing different voices. And over the weeks and months, DFA is about essentially putting different points of view on the table so you can make your own views and opinions. And that's what DFA is about. Next week, it'll be me. I'll be on. We'll be doing some Q&A, and I'll share some specific information about my surveys, which will be out. And Damien Klassen will be on the following week. And beyond that, I've got some other guests lined up as well. So keep those in mind. Just before I go, show you that the dogs, well, we've got one dog. So Meteor has come down here to say she's ready to go for another walk. So that'll be my next objective. But Luna's curled up there, and luckily she didn't make too much noise today. So the bin collection was a little earlier, which is always good. Anyway, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. And thank you very much. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you haven't done so, check our live shows next Tuesday and beyond. And also check our recorded shows out, published daily on our channel. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.